Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians, from the eastern outskirts of the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk region to north of Pokrovsk and the northeastern parts of the Donetsk region and the eastern flank of Lyman and northern flank of Siversk. The Russians continue their offensive operations. The Russians advanced here to the east of Lyman, gaining control of positions on the outskirts of Zarishne. The Russians also managed to capture the fortified trenches north of Siversk. They are further securing the positions here on the eastern flank to supply the forces north of Pokrovsk, and along the second line of defense they've managed to capture the settlement of Verbove. And to the east of Poltavka, they are pushing into the settlement. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain control over several fortified positions on the outskirts of Zarishne on the southern and western flank. The Russians managed to gain control over the fortified zone here to the south of Zarishne and here on the western outskirts. Both of these are overlooking the Ukrainian positions that were present within Zarishne. With the capture of these positions by the Russians, they've managed to secure the positions in the southern parts of Zarishne and have managed to infiltrate the forest patch area in the south of Zarishne. This completely secures the western flank in the southern positions of Zarishne, allowing the Russians to start concentrating their forces within the southern parts of the settlement to push in the southern direction towards Yampil, where they can connect with the forces operating in the east with the ones operating in the north. Gaining control over this fortified zone on the northern flank of Yampil connects the forces within Zarishne with the forces crossing over the Sherbets river line within the Pervomaiske first area, further securing the positions of the Russians on the eastern flank of Lyman, and at the same time strengthening the logistics of their forces across the river line. It also covers the northern flank of Yampil, meaning the capture of these fortified positions would allow for the capture of Yampil and the secure holding of the settlement, similar to the fortifications on the outskirts of Zarishne. The Russians also managed to gain full control over the trench line here to the north of Siversk and the control over the residential area in the northwestern parts. This has allowed them to completely secure the northern flank of Siversk up to the Bakhmutovka river, where the Ukrainians still have a tiny position here along the forested areas on the northern flank, which Russians will likely capture soon, as they've now reached the outskirts of Dronivka. Gaining control over Dronivka will allow them to connect with the forces on the northern bank of the Siversk-Donetsk river line in the Serbiansky first area to secure the railway connection between Dronivka and Yampil, and to gain a crossing across the Bakhmutovka river on the northwestern flank of Siversk. With their recent advances on the northern flank of Siversk, it points to the Russians bypassing Siversk in its entirety by pushing along the northwestern flank to cut off the supply lines leading into Siversk and gain control over the settlements along the Siversk-Donetsk river line. As they've managed to capture and secure the Serbiansky first area, their offensive capabilities on the northern flank of Siversk has significantly increased, as they have removed the Ukrainian drone coverage from the northern flank and replaced it with their own drone coverage. Cutting off the highway to the west of Siversk or gaining fire control of it, combined with offensive operations to gain control over Zanivka in the south and push up to Pokrovsk, would allow the Russians to operationally encircle Siversk rather than storming the settlements directly head on. Despite that, the Russians are also developing offensive operations on the southeastern and southwestern flanks towards Siversk itself, and with control over the trenches and fortifications north of Siversk, the road is open for their forces to storm Siversk from the north as well. To the south of this, the Russians have managed to advance in the northern flank of Pokrovsk, regaining control over the flank of Mayak, allowing for a wider control over the supply lines leading up to Kucherevyar, where geolocated footage confirmed the Russian presence within the northern outskirts of the settlement, and thereby full control of it, combined with the recent offensive operations on the northwestern flank of Shachove and to the west of the settlement, as well as the recent developments on the northeastern flank in the vicinity of Sofiyevka. The Russians continue to work on the flanks of Volodymyrivka, Shachove, Sofiyevka, and Turetsk to cut off the supply lines leading to their counterattack operations and further securing their positions here along the supply lines to the northern flank and their positions in the area. The Ukrainians were just a few days ago very close to completely eliminating the Russian grouping by cutting off the supply lines and consolidating their positions within Novotorosk and Boykivka. However, recent Russian counterattacks managed to secure the settlements and secure the supply lines leading up in the north, allowing them to not just strengthen their possessions, but also flanking the Ukrainian offensive operations to cut off their supplies and reversing the situation. That means within just a few days, the Russians turned a situation that was a disaster for them into a situation that is a disaster for the Ukrainians. If the Russians are able to completely reverse the situation, gain control over the settlements on the northern and western flanks of the northern incursion, and consolidate their positions for a push in the direction of Rodinske in the south, the Russians will be able to completely undo the Ukrainian counterattack here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, while still holding their positions within the city that were gained during these Ukrainian counterattacks, where they were concentrating their forces elsewhere. That means the Russians would not just have reversed the situation, but also gained something during these operations, which will allow them to further secure the positions within the city itself and gain control over it. The Russians continue their work to gain full control over Pokrovsk. However, this is no easy endeavor. The Ukrainians have a significant concentration of forces that are well supplied, as they have prioritized the defense of the city and the surrounding fortifications in the area over other sectors of the front line, such as the first and second lines of defense within the Zaporizhzhia and the Dnipropetrovsk region, as the city of Pokrovsk is in a more critical position than these fortifications, as the Russians have yet to gain control over important logistics. This means that the Ukrainians still have time to react to the situation within the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia region. This has allowed the Russians to gain control over approximately 250 square kilometers within these two regions over the past month. However, the progress within Pokrovsk has been limited. And that also brings us back to the Russian tactic that has been in use, and that is, if the Ukrainians counterattack or launch a concentration of forces for defensive operations in an area, the Russians simply redirected their efforts to other sectors of the front line, as we've seen here in the southwest. The Russians have managed to gain full control over Verbove. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians are raising their flag within the settlement, and from this we can see that the Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over the road that leads further along the second line of defense, where we are now reaching close to a critical point, because as we can see, the Russians are now just a few kilometers away from the highway. Gaining control over the highway and the fortified positions and settlements within close proximity to this highway will allow the Russians to cut off the highway itself and expand their offensive operations within this section of the front line to gain control over the fortified positions in the southern direction along the highway towards Huliepole by attacking it from the rear and the weak point of the fortifications throughout this entire area, and also to continue the advances along the first line of defense towards Huliepole directly from the rear. And it also opens the road for offensive operations in the northern direction towards Pokrovsk, which is an important logistical hub for the Ukrainian forces in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Speaking of offensive operations in the Dnipropetrovsk region and Zaporizhzhia region on the flanks of the first and second line of defense, the Russians have started stalling Poltavka, the eastern residential area east of the Yanchir River, to gain control of the remaining parts of the river line itself. The Russians are also present on the southern outskirts of Poltavka through their presence within Melinivka, within the western bank of the Yanchir River. The Russian objective is to gain control over the eastern residential area, push through the central parts and the southern flank, and to gain full control over Poltavka. This will allow them to gain control over the southern flank of the defensive line and to concentrate their forces on the northern flank, where the Russians have control over the majority of the fortifications, leaving just a single fortified position east of the Yanchir River remaining under Ukrainian control. And with the fighting within Novokhyrovka, the road is opening for Russian forces to pass through the main road towards the Yanchir River and in the direction of Novovasilivske and Novomykolaivka on the flank of the first line of defense. The Russians continue to develop their offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense, as well as to the flanks of both of them in the western outskirts of the Donetsk region into the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia region. as well as continuous offensive operations within the Donetsk region itself from the northern to the southern outskirts. For the month of September, the numbers are now out. Taking a look at it, the Russians have managed to capture approximately 17 square kilometers of the Luhansk region, leaving 43 square kilometers remaining under Ukrainian control. As for the Donetsk region, the Russians have managed to capture approximately 161 square kilometers, or a 0.66% increase in territory under their control, leaving under 6,000 square kilometers remaining under Ukrainian control, or 21.16%. The Zaporizhia region has seen an increase of 0.41% under Russian control compared to last month of just 0.09%. So we're seeing a significant increase in the pace of Zaporizhia region territory falling under Russian control, where we also see a halving of the speed in the Donetsk region compared to last month, where the Russians captured 1.2%. So we're seeing a variety, a change in the speed. We're also seeing the Dnipropetrovsk region last month was 0.08%. This month is 0.37% of the region captured by the Russian forces over the past 30 days. These are all the numbers for the discussions that I take during the month. The tactics the Russians are using is evident in these numbers. Ukraine's redirected forces to the Donetsk region to strengthen their defense. This allowed the Russians to strengthen offensive operations in other regions, speeding up the capture of territories in these directions. While we're seeing the Russians have completely abandoned offensive operations in the Sumy region, where the only advances was to capture Yunakivka. Beyond that, the Ukrainians continue their counterattack operations to regain control over the region. This led to 6 square kilometers recaptured by the Ukrainians over the month of September. So the Russians are completely on defense with that regard. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, join my Patreon and YouTube membership, gain access to my recap map, amongst other additional benefits. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.